Dawn, the late dawn of a grey, wintry morning, hung over Versailles. Within the palace walls those vast corridors, which had lately rung to sounds of life and laughter, stretched endlessly out in the ghostly chill of the vague light. Chill and stillness had crept also under many doors, and they breathed over that stately room in which Marie de Châteauroux was accustomed to take the few hours of relief from feverish life granted her by kindly sleep. Though the favorite's apartment was as dark as drawn curtains could make it, nevertheless a thin gleam of grey shot relentlessly between hanging and wall, and, falling athwart the canopied bed, announced that Madame's temporary rest approached its end. Against this decree, however, Madame's attitude would seem to rebel. She lay, apparently in profound sleep, in the very center of the great bed, sheets and cover drawn closely about her, up to her throat. Only one hand, half hidden in lace, and her head, with its framing mass of yellow, powder-dulled hair, were visible. In her waking life that head of the Duchess of Châteauroux was celebrated for its marvelous poise. And even now, as it lay relaxed upon the pillow, the effect of its daytime majesty was not quite lost. Viewed thus, devoid of animation or expression, the pure, classic beauty of the face showed to better advantage, perhaps, than at another time. Already, however, ennui, and the constant effort at appearance of pleasure, had left their marks upon the regular features, and, indeed, much other than mere beauty might be found in the countenance. If there were power in the breadth of the forehead, there was too much determination in the chin, while at each corner of the delicate mouth a faint line gave a cast of resolution, dogged and relentless, to the feminine ensemble. Presently, as the shadows melted more and more, the woman's silken-lashed eyes fell open, and the first of her waking thoughts was expressed in a long, melancholy sigh. The duties of the Duchess as Lady of the Palace of the Queen necessitated her presence at the grand toilet of Her Majesty on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. On Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday, therefore, except on those weeks when she was in constant attendance on Louis's consort, the Châteauroux accustomed the court to a toilet of her own, which the king's faction religiously frequented, while the Queen's circle, the religious party, rolled their eyes, clasped their hands, violently denounced the insolence of it, and fervently wished that they might go, too. Certainly Madame's morning receptions were eminently successful, and, however much gentle Marie Leczinska might disapprove of them in secret, she never had the courage to anger her husband by voicing her sense of indignity. Thus, 6 mornings of the week being provided for, on Saturday the Duchess confessed herself, though no absolution was to be had, and prayed forgiveness for the other part of her life. As Madame awoke, and the clock upon her mantelpiece struck 8, a door into the room swung open, and a trimly dressed maid came in. She pushed back the curtains from the window, looped them up, and crossed to the bedside. "'Tis you, Antoinette," came a voice from beneath the canopy. "Yes, madam. Shall I bring the water?" "At once." As Antoinette once more disappeared, Madame sat up and pushed aside the curtains of her bed. For the following quarter of an hour, while the first part of the toilet was being performed, the second and elaborate half of that daily function was prepared for in the second room of the favorite suite, the famous boudoir. A remarkable little room this, with its silken hangings of Persian blue and green and white, and a remarkable little man it was who sat informally upon a tabouret, in the midst of the graceful confusion of chairs, sofas, consoles, and inlaid stands, while in front of him was the second dressing-table, whereon reposed the paraphernalia of the coiffeur, and beside him was a small bronze brazier, or charcoal, for the heating of irons, burned. The profession of Emma Marchand was instantly proclaimed by his elaborate elegance of wig. He had been, at some time, perruquier to each French queen of the last 3 decades, from Madame de Prie to the ill-fated sisters of the present Duchess. Just now he was ogling, in the last court manner, the second wardrobe girl, who stood near him, beside a spindle-legged table, polishing a mirror. And Celestine ogled the weazen Marchand while she worked and wondered if Madame would miss her last present from Darganson, a Chinese mandarin with a rueful smile, who sat alone in the cabinet of toys, and ceaselessly waved his head. The courtly companionship between the 2 servants had lasted for some time when there came a faint scratch on the bedroom door.
It was Antoinette's friendly signal.
The hairdresser leaped to his place and bent over the irons, while Celestine forced her eyes from the bit of porcelain and put away her polishing cloth as Madame de Châteauroux entered the room. The Duchess seated herself before the first table, where Amélie Celestine administered certain effective and skillfully applied touches to the pale face, and when these had rendered her to her mind for the hour, Madame surrendered herself into Marchand's hands, where she would remain for a good part of the morning. The preliminary brushing of the yellow locks had not yet been completed when the first valet de chambre threw open the door from the antechamber and announced carefully, "The Duc de Gesvres."
De Gesvres, as usual, delayed his entrance a full minute.
Then he came in languidly, snuff-box in his right hand, hat under his arm, perruque immaculate, and eyeglass dangling at his waist.
He bowed.
Madame raised her hand. The Duke advanced, lifted it to his lips, and left upon its fair surface a faint red trace of his salute.
Madame smiled.
"You have come to me early," she said. "I arose," remarked the man, pensively, "to find the world in grey. I arrayed myself to match the sky, and came to seek the sun. When I leave you I shall don pale blue, for you will drive the clouds from my day."
Madame smiled again. "Thank you. But the grey is marvelously becoming. Pray do not attempt a second toilet this morning. One is singularly depressing."
"Surely, you are not depressed, Madame de Versailles?" he asked, idly, examining her negligée of India muslin with approval. "Why depressed?"
"Louis was furious at your unaccountable absence from the salon last evening, and would play with no one.
He stayed in a corner for 2 hours, railing at Diori and permitting not a soul to approach."
"Is it in pity for him, this morning, that you suffer?" Madame shrugged.
"I do not waste time in pity of His Majesty.
At the request of Madame d'Alincourt, I spent last evening in the apartments of the Queen."
"Good heaven!
Then, Madame, allow me to express my deepest sympathy. I had no idea that you would play so recklessly with ennui.
Why, your very gossip is a day old. You, then, monsieur, I hail as my deliverer.
Will you not act as my nouvelles à la main, that I may make no irretrievable blunder today?"
Madame desires, the king is at her feet.
Madame requests, and the gods obey. Where must one begin? At the beginning.
De Gesvres smiled slowly in retrospection. It was for this precise opportunity that he had risen an hour early and dared royal displeasure by being alone with the favorite for 30 minutes. He rose from the chair he had taken, drew a tabouret to within a yard of the Duchess's knee, and reseated himself significantly. "You frighten me, my lord."
"It must be serious."
De Gesvres shrugged.
"Oh, not necessarily."
"You shall judge." He glanced meditatively at her feet, tapped his snuff-box, and began to speak just as Marchand finished the first curl. "Without doubt, madam, even after the deplorable past evening, you still recollect the rather outré events of the day before. You cannot yet have forgotten the last Rambouillet chase, the gage you offered, His Majesty's unfortunate chagrin, and the intrepid, if rash, ardor of your young cousin, Count Claude?" "Thus far my memory carries me, monsieur."
"Continue."
"Well, the rest is, indeed, curious. In spite of the Count's heroic gallantry, he appeared, later in the day, to have repented somewhat of having so eagerly dared the royal displeasure. A company of my friends were so good as to visit, with me, my hotel, you know its condition, for play, on this very evening. By great good fortune, His Majesty, together with a companion, did us the honor himself to join our party a little later. When the king beheld his successful rival, the Count, seated with us, he instantly proposed that the two of them play a round for high stakes. Louis, madam, offered a diamond star valued, perhaps, at 50,000 francs, or more, against
my glove. Even so.
You have, perhaps, heard the tale, queried the Duke, hastily, with a suspicion of anxiety in his voice. Madame de Châteauroux noticed this, but her face continued to be as impassive as that of her smiling mandarin.
You forget my evening, monsieur. I know nothing. Continue, I beg of you.
Monsieur le Marquis de Coigny and the Comte de Maurepas, announced the valet. De Gevres coughed, but his face expressed none of the disappointment that he felt. Madame de Châteauroux greeted both gentlemen with imperturbable courtesy, and the three nobles, after her salutes were over, exchanged greetings. Then the favorite said, at once,
Pray be seated, messrs. M. de Gevres is telling me a most interesting anecdote. Pardon if I ask him to finish it. Since it in a way concerns myself, I am so vain as to be curious.
The latecomers bowed and looked at the Duke, who, in that instant, had mentally sounded the intruders, considered his course, and decided to risk a continuance of his original plan.
Without any noticeable hesitation, the story went on.
As I said, His Majesty and the Count de Mailly were to play together for possession of the glove. The king threw first, 4 and 3.
De Mailly came next with 5 and 2. Ah, murmured de Coigny.
Again Louis with 10, and the Count turned precisely the same number.
His Majesty was visibly tingling with anxiety. He was about to throw for the last time, with a prayer to the gods, when the Count took pity on him. He offered the glove, asked Madame, quietly. De Gevres bowed. In a way, Duchess.
He offered to exchange the stakes.
Oh, cried Maurepas, angrily. Dastardly, muttered de Coigny.
Madame de Châteauroux flushed scarlet with anger beneath her powder. Little Marchand, trained to high gallantry by long experience in haunts of the elect, left an iron in Toulon, and slightly scorched a lock of hair. His little eyes winked furiously with disapproval of the Count.
Monsieur le Marquis de Mailly Nesle, came the announcement. De Gevres coughed again, and, amid rather a strained silence, Henri entered the apartment of his sister.
He looked about him for a moment or two with some curiosity, feeling the awkwardness of his arrival, and considering what it would be wise to say. Maurepas, the diplomat, recovered himself quickly, remarking, in a tone which relieved them all, "This brother's devotion, my dear Marquis, is gratifying to behold. One is really never so certain of finding you anywhere at a given hour as here, in your sister's boudoir." Madame de Coigny has, I believe, no mornings à la toilette, observed Madame de Coigny's husband.
Maurepas looked sharply at the speaker, while the others smiled, and the Duchess made everyone still easier by laughing lightly.
Her sang-froid is unapproachable, murmured de Gevres to Maurepas, behind his hand. You have certainly put it to strong test this morning, was the reply, rather coldly given.
L'Abbé de Saint-Pierre and l'Abbé de Vries.
The two ecclesiastics entered from the antechamber and advanced, side by side, towards the Duchess. The taller of the two, Saint-Pierre, was a very desirable person in salon society, and could turn as neat a compliment or as fine an epigram in spontaneous verse as any member in the rhyming brotherhood. At sight of Saint-Pierre's companion, who was a stranger here, the Marquis de Coigny gave a sudden, imperceptible start, and Henri de Mailly suppressed an exclamation.
Madame la Duchesse, permit me to present to you my friend and colleague, l'Abbé Bertrand de Vries, of Fontainebleau.